All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I'm recording this video. I hope you're all well, and I wanted to deal with a couple of questions that I was able to deal with to a certain degree in the morning section and with very little time in the afternoon section. And this relates to the big question of what this course is about. So this is the first of two videos that I hope to be able to prepare today. So the big question of what the course is about actually is related to the slightly smaller, but not much smaller questions that were raised in the last semester. So Dean Herron, at great length, on many occasions, talked about important questions that courses like ours need to ask. Really, any course, any effort that we do, any attempt at self-discovery needs to be about. And those three questions are: who are we, where are we going, what should we do? So the dean dealt quite a bit with the questions of who are we, where are we going. That was really the focus of what he spent the course about, specifically with connection to cities. And so what I want to do is to go one step further and to talk about what that means and in the context of this course. So the first thing that I want to say is that those first two questions, who are we and where are we going, these are questions that any field asks. It's not just political science, it's not just social sciences. Really, any field asks it, and it's no surprise that physics asks this as well. Every other major subject asks this. For physics, the question is, where is an electron and where is it going? It turns out that in physics, you can't actually answer both of those questions at the same time. At least you can't determine position and direction simultaneously. And the social sciences, it's a little easier because we can think about these things. But of course, in the social sciences, it's more complicated because the things we're dealing with in the social sciences have minds of their own. So the questions of who are we and where are we going start out last semester's course. But they ended up in the course with what should we do about it? What does this information that we have cause us to think about how we should act? And so it's no surprise that really we go from position and direction to intention. And that's what our course is about. It's about what should we do and really about thinking toward the end of changing the world around us, actually making actions and not just passively receiving the information. Turns out that intention actually has several subsections, sub-questions to it. That question, what should we do, has a couple different meanings. One is the question, what should we do in terms of what it is that we should do something about. And the other question is what actually should we do to do it? How should we actually do it? So it's got those goals and mechanisms, which can be translated in other ways into ideas of, say, ends and means. This is actually a good time to give you some of the highfalutin education you're paying for by bringing in some German words and some German scholars. Because in this regard, I think the most important insights into this question provided by a German scholar by the name of Max Weber. You can pronounce it Max Weber, but scholars at least will think you sound kind of dumb, so say Max Weber. So Max Weber actually talks about the difference between ends and means when he talks about power, when he talks about politics, when he talks about anything in society. Of course, this being German, instead of those two nice, simple words, the German has polysyllabic meanings or polysyllabic words for those meanings, Wertrationalität and Zweckrationalität. Actually, it's a little bit more important, a little bit more sophisticated than just the word for ends and means. Because Wert in German relates to value, so it's value rationality, and Zweckrationalität is related to goal. Zweck is your goal. So Weber is really interested when you make decisions, what kind of rationality are you using? Are you using a rationality of ends, what it is that you want, or are you using a rationality of means, the way to actually get there? So in this sense, we look at value rationality versus instrumental rationality, and we have to look at the contrast between those two. So the first question is really asking, does what I want make sense to want? I think all of us have wanted things that we know don't make any actual sense to want. Probably dated people, we thought to ourselves, does this really make sense to seek this particular person? We've bought things, we've read things, and wondered, is it actually a good thing to want this thing? So we have to form our consciences, we have to form our desires in such a way as to want those things that are wantable. Weber doesn't really provide much much guidance as to what should be wantable. Religions do that. Codes of conduct do that. Various ways of thinking about how we should be behaving, they do that. Once we've done that, though, once we've decided what it is that we want, we really have to think about, are we going about getting it in the right way? And that's where the Zweckrationalität comes into play. We really need to think about the mechanisms or means that we're using or trying to use to get the thing that we want. Now, the first question, I've got a bow tie here, the first semester was really about, does it make sense to want what I want? I think a lot of what the dean did when he was presenting, when he was talking to you all, was to think about what it is that we want as a society, what it is that we want as individuals within that society. Second is really what this course is about. It's about whether, given a certain desire, given a certain thing that we want, whether we're actually doing the things that we need to do to get what we want. Because as we all know, in addition to maybe wanting things that we don't necessarily need or that aren't necessarily good for us, once we've identified what it is that we want, we can also work in ways that may or may not get us to our goal. So there are ways that will get us to our goal effectively, and there are ways that will get us to our goal not so effectively. The first course, the first semester, was really about the question of values, as I've said, and we used a book way of seeing. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of thinking about what it is that we want, and how do we understand what we see. A second question is about ways of doing. Now, there is no actual book, Ways of Doing, by Max Weber, but if there were, this is the course that we would read it. And since we don't have that actual book by Max Weber, we're going to look at lots of other books and lots of other things that are going to get us to that particular end. So if the first semester was ways of seeing, this second semester is very clearly ways of doing. So back to our original third question, what should we do? What should we do has two elements. The first is what it is that we want, and the second is what it is that we're doing to actually get those things that we want. Turns out to be even more complicated than that, because that second question of what are we doing to get what we want has subsets in itself. First is what we think about how to get it. What are our plans? What are the ideas that we've got that would get us there? So what is the design that we have to get us to our particular set of goals? Second is whether we have the resources, whether we have the means to do it, whether we have the means to get there. So if we were to use a science example, I know that's good for some of you, not so good for others, but if you're using a science example, first question would be, say, should we go to the moon? Is it a good idea to go to the moon or not to go to the moon? Well, at a certain point in human life, certain people decided that that would be a really magnificent idea. It's out there, it looks appealing, it would be a great step for humankind. Once we've decided whether that's a good idea or not, now then we need to think about how we're going to actually get there. Now, a lot of people decided in the 1920s and 1930s that actually it was a good idea to go to the moon. And they had plans, they had rockets designed, they had motors designed, but they didn't work well enough to actually produce the thrust that would get people to the moon. They couldn't produce vehicles that were airtight enough to get them there. They couldn't do the kinds of technology necessary to actually land people on the moon. So they had great ideas, great plans, but it took a long time and a lot of development for them to actually develop the resources and support that they needed within that subset of means to actually get to that place. Any good plan has to both have the plan for getting there, has to have a good design for getting there, but it's also got to get the resources and support. Turns out that moon landing was as much a political challenge as it was a scientific one. Probably landing on the moon would have been possible in the 1940s or in the 1950s. But it took until the 1960s to get the kinds of enthusiasm and energy in one of those countries that have the resources to be able to do it. So we need to think about not only what it is that we want, we need to think about what are our means of getting there, and within that we need to think about both our plans and the resources that we need to get there. This is the exact same thing that we're going to do when we think about social change. We're going to look at all of those various levels. So this brings us to the question of what should we do in detail. And in this case, I want to actually apply the lessons that I'm talking about to the course itself. So this course is about what should we do. Now, is that a good thing to have? I don't know. I think it is. I think that a university should be working with students to think about what it is that students want and how they should get there. So I think this is a good thing to do. The dean certainly thinks so. He spent a lot of last semester thinking about helping you think about, working with you to think about what good things to do are, especially related to the city. So let's call this course a good thing to do. You may disagree, but let's call it that. So then the question is, what do we need to do to actually get there? What are the plans, and then what are the resources? This course, and particularly the thing I'm telling you right now, is really about our plan to get there. And then we'll talk about the resources in a bit. So here's my plan to actually get us to that goal now that I've decided that it's a good thing to do. And what I've decided is that there are actually three sub-elements of this. So this question, what should we do? And this is related to the ends and means distinction and the plans and support distinction that I talked about above. It really has three subsections. The first subsection of this course I'm calling what's wrong. The question there is, what's wrong with our society? What social problems do we need to fix, do we need to work on? If you weren't mandated by this course, you may have other visions of what's wrong. So you may think what's wrong is that I don't make enough money. What's wrong is that I pay too much for college. What's wrong is that I want to be in a different relationship vis-a-vis my parents or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. In this course, we're going to ask you to think about what's wrong in terms of society, so bigger societal problems. And we're asking you, as you did last week and you're going to do again this week, to identify and narrow down the specific problems in society that are worth tackling. The second question then moves to the ways of getting to that. So we need to think about the plans and ideas element. We need to think about the question of what works. So for any given problem, there are mechanisms, there are ways of trying to solve that problem. There are probably multiple ways of trying to solve that problem. There are certainly multiple ways of getting somebody to the moon. There are multiple ways of thinking about homelessness. There are multiple ways of thinking about your relationship with your parents or your significant other. So in all these realms, there are different ways of actually getting to the end, getting to the goal that we see. Our question is going to be in this course to think about specifically what those means are given the problem that we first cited. And then finally, there's a section I'm calling What Wins. Now this one's a little bit more awkwardly phrased, and mainly I did it so that I could get these nice questions, all of which begin with W and W. But really what I mean here is, how do we develop the support? How do we develop the resources to actually put our plans into practice? And so it's not just a question of saying, I think this would be a great way to solve the problem. If only the world were like this, if only I had such and such resources, this is how we would do it. We've got to ask the next question about how do we actually get those resources to make it happen, or otherwise it's just pie in the sky. These aren't real plans. So this is the area, these are the realms that I think we're going to focus on in this class. In fact, I know we're going to focus on them in this class. And they have days attached to them. They have particular places. So we have a 15-week semester, really 16 weeks when you include spring break, but I'm not including that in here. So we have 15 class periods together. One of those is already over. That was last week. We're in the second week now, and we're thinking about what's wrong. So we're thinking in that second week still about the question of what is the social problem that we want to solve. As you've seen, we're going to think about this in the big picture in the class, but we're also going to think about it in small groups. So by now, all of you are in the process of dividing up into small groups to think about a particular question, a particular problem that you think is worth solving. In the third through the sixth week, that's the following week, next week, and the weeks that follow, what we're going to start to think about is what are actual ways of solving it. And there are different ways of solving different kinds of social problems. Some of those problems relate to government, some of them relate to the free market, some of them relate to voluntary groups and associations, some of them relate to family and friends and close personal network. So what we're going to do is think about what works, and we're going to think about what those plans are. And really, in the end, the goal will be to think about particular policy options. Then finally, we're going to think about what wins. And what we're going to do when we think about what wins is, how do you work with the world around you? How do you engage with the actual institutions, structures, alternatives that are out there to get this problem solved? Let me go into a little bit more detail about that. So first 2 weeks, as I talked about, we're already in the second week. We're going to think about what's wrong. You're going to do this in your small groups. You're going to start to identify small groups of 4 to 6 people who are going to work on particular problems that you all in that group care about enough to spend a semester on it. Then in the second month of the course, we're going to think about what it would take to actually solve those problems. What are the various options and various mechanisms? And you see I have a graphic with lots of tools here. What are the ways to solve this particular problem? And then finally, we're going to think about what wins. In that question of what wins, we're actually going to have 3 subsets. So we're going to think about engaging structures, we're going to think about engaging institutions, and we're going to think about considering alternatives. What do I mean by that? First, by engaging structures. What I want to talk to you about over the next few weeks in particular is the idea that surrounding us are fundamental underlying distributions of resources, the haves and the have-nots, and distributions of attitudes, what people think, that certain people like markets and other people like government, that certain people like freedom of speech and other people think that the social order is too fragile to permit freedom of speech. We're going to look at the underlying value structures in our society in weeks 7 through 9, just before spring break. We're going to look at those underlying structures and we're going to try and figure out what they're like. Because if you're going to solve a problem, if you're going to build the kinds of institutions, if you're going to build the kinds of solutions, you're going to have to work within the structures. And what people want or what they don't want, knowing those things and being able to work with those things is going to be absolutely fundamental. In the week that follows that, 3 weeks that follow that, weeks 10 through 12, we're going to think about engaging institutions. And what I mean there is looking at the organizations, the ways that people organize to solve those problems or to solve problems in general. And that's going to mean looking at social movements, looking at media, looking at political parties, looking at elections and legislatures to think about what are the actual procedural mechanisms, the actual institutional mechanisms, and as we would with values and resources, how do we work within those to actually solve the problem? And then in the final 2 weeks of the class, while you're working on your actual projects, while you're deep in the midst of it, putting together a proposal for solving this problem and showing how you've already begun to think about solving it, I'm going to be talking to you from a more abstract level to consider alternatives. Because one of the things that has become clear to me is that the way that we do it in this country is not the only way to do it. There are lots of alternatives. And in fact, my focus of study, the thing that I do as an academic, is to look not so much at the United States, but at Europe and other countries. So I want to think about the other alternatives that are available to us in the broader picture. And that's going to relate to alternatives regarding regional governments, what we call federalism versus centralization, Supreme Courts and how they work, the Constitution of the United States, the interaction between our legislature and our executive, and so on. And we're going to be doing this just at a time that the United States political structures, institutions, are under some of the most interesting, shall we put it that way, conditions that I've ever seen as an academic, I've ever seen as a political scientist. So while we're doing this, while we're engaging in these questions and problems in the United States, we're going to actually look at how other countries solve problems, what other countries do in these circumstances, to think about the broader questions of alternatives. Then in that 15th week, the alternatives are going to be provided not by me, but by you. Because some of the better group presentations that we get, and I'll talk about the group presentations in a minute, some of the better group presentations are going to form the basis of the presentations that are going to appear in class. On that 15th week, it's your chance as students to talk about your solutions to the problems that you've identified. Coming to the end of what I want to talk about in this short video, but what I want to say is, how are we going to do these things? We're going to use a number of multiple mechanisms. This course has a lot of moving parts, so we ask for your patience, we ask for your willingness to engage with us, because we've really tried very hard to put this together in such a way that it makes sense. And if it doesn't, you can let us know. We're always willing to modify and change. How are we going to do this? The first way we're going to do it is what you've already seen. It's the thing that happens on Monday. It's the large section. This is really the time for me to provide an overall framework, a kind of theoretical, intellectual, academic framework for what's going on. We don't call it a large lecture because I'm going to try to do as little lecturing as possible and as much discussion, kind of like what you did with Dean Heron, where I ask questions and you sometimes answer them, and when you don't answer them, I badger you and answer them. So that's what we're going to do in the large sections, and we're going to work through all of the basic issues to provide a framework for the small section, which is frankly where you're going to spend most of your time. You have an amazing staff of senior lecturers, people with their own doctorates, people with their own research agendas, really some amazing teachers and amazing scholars. So you're going to work with them to solve these specific questions and these specific problems. In that context, you're going to do a whole bunch of things. You're going to do readings, and you're going to talk about those readings. I've tried to select readings that will be appropriate for the class, readings that aren't as unfortunate as most readings for classes like this, that have a little bit more life and a little bit more application and practicality to them. It doesn't mean it's all going to be fun and games, but at least we're going to work on books that are a little bit more interesting. Where we're not, at least I can say the books are going to be free, so we're going to use a lot of open source materials and other things. I want you to buy the one book, the Owner's Manual, and other than that, everything else is going to be out online. So I want you to do the readings, really do them. They're not going to be that taxing, and we're going to provide, whenever we can, annotations and other things to help the reading go quickly and to make sense to you. You're also going to be working, as I mentioned, in small groups with other people. In every class, every day in small section, you're going to be thinking about the big issues we're talking about in the large section, big issues that are being talked about in your readings, and you're going to work on applying them to your specific small section. And so you're going to be thinking about your problem, whether that's homelessness or blight or a whole variety of other much more interesting in ways, much more complicated and nuanced questions. You're going to look at those questions and problems with regard to that broader question of what's wrong, what works, and what wins. Finally, you're going to be out in the community doing service. One of the best ways to learn about what we're doing, to learn about actual social problems, is to work with people who do them. So you're going to be looking for organizations where you can work with those who are affected by the problems out in the community, in the city of Detroit, in the metropolitan area of Detroit, both with people who are affected by the problems, with those who are trying to solve them, especially using nonprofit organizations and other kinds of organizations, and finally, when we can, with government officials and those who are responsible for implementing the kinds of policies that are related directly to that. So this is the broader framework of the class. My goal, and you can read it on the screen, my goal is that by the end of this semester, you know enough to actually participate actively in the process of making social change. It's not that you can't do that now, but as I argued in class, this is a skill. It's not just something you pick up. It's not just something that comes to you by birth or by osmosis. It's something you actually have to do. You actually have to work at, just like any of the skills that you're engaged in, just like driving, just like brain surgery, just like any of those things that you want to do. This is something that's going to require a little bit of work and a little bit of effort. The payoff is that if you do it right, if you make this work, you can actually change the world around you. Not in big ways always, although sometimes that's possible, but in ways that concretely make a difference. So with that, I'm going to bid you adieu for the moment. I'm going to try and make another video in a little bit, but I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday. Thanks so much.